Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This is the panel discussion on 25 years after the Berlin Wall, making democracy work in the rest of Europe. And it's great to have everyone here. We have an amazingly qualified panel to discuss this issue. My name is Konrad Kiesel. I'm the Director of Communications at the Milken Institute. My panelists are people who all were involved, active, knowledgeable, and participants in some of the events back then, and have been just as active and involved in events since then. So what I'd like to do is we'll spend about 15, 20 minutes maybe talking about the events in 1989 and the 1980s, a little bit of history, with the idea that the history is going to help us understand the present and hopefully also illuminate the future. We will have some time for questions at the end, so please, as you are listening to the insights from the panelists, think about what you want to ask, and then we will turn to questions for the last 10 or 15 minutes, time permitting. So I'll just start off briefly with introductions. The full biographies are in your programs and also on the app, and there's a lot there. I'll just mention a few sentences to give everyone an example or a sense of how qualified people are. To my right, starting over there, is J.D. Bindernagel. J.D. is the senior advisor to strategy. Was it 21 or XXI? 21 partners. Former U.S. ambassador and minister at the U.S. Embassy in East Berlin. He served during the 1989 fall of the Berlin Wall, as well as during the reunification of Germany, as well as a number of other distinguished posts within the State Department. Immediately to my right, Markus Meckel is the president of the German War Graves Commission and the former, as I understand it, Markus, democratically elected.
After the election. That's important.
Yes, that's an important qualification. I want to make sure I got out there, of the German Democratic Republic. And how long did you serve in that position?
Only some months. 120 days or 30 days. Yes.
A short but distinguished diplomatic service.
It was 2+4 talks. This was the main issue.
Okay. So to my left is Janusz Onyszkiewicz. I hope I pronounced it somewhat correctly. Janusz was the former Minister of Defense in Poland, but just as importantly for the purposes of this discussion, was involved in the Solidarity movement from almost the beginning?
Well, even before the beginning.
Before the beginning. So he is knowledgeable about events even before the Solidarity strike in Gdansk in 1980, I believe. And finally, to my far left is Michael Sedlacek, who is the Consul General of the Czech Republic here in Los Angeles. And Michael, as you can tell, is younger than the rest of the panelists a little bit, but was still involved in 1989. I think, Michael, you were a student in Prague at the time?
Yeah.
Okay. So he's now Consul General, has been serving in various Czech government posts, and studied law at Charles University. And importantly, since this is Los Angeles and everybody in town has a screenplay, he studied screenwriting at the Film and TV School, which is one of his qualifications perhaps for being here in Los Angeles. Yes. So welcome to everyone. So again, I do want to spend a few minutes talking about, because we are this year in the 25th anniversary year of the events of 1989, which many of us remember as an epical event in not only European but world history. We're also, of course, in the 100th year, the 100th anniversary year of the beginning of World War I. And those two different anniversaries obviously mean very different things. But in 1989, the world stood transfixed as people in these countries really took an amazing step forward. And you know, I think most of us are aware of what happened. We were certainly watching at the time. But I'd like to ask each of our panelists, just to start off, to say a few words in terms of, or tell us what you think the kind of the events before the event was. What was it that happened before the events in August of, or in the autumn of 1989, that made those events, the ones in the autumn of '89, inevitable, that they were definitely going to happen, to the extent you can say that. So I'll start.
I think Janusz is the first one because solidarity was first.
Yes.
Okay, fair enough. Very nicely
well,
put, Marcus.
okay, I will begin with 1980, where solidarity was born. As you probably all know, before 1980, well, basically everybody had a sense that democracy is more or less doomed. That, you know, to fight totalitarian system is something futile, because the only experience we had so far with collapse of totalitarian system was the collapse of Nazi Germany. But that was the result of the cataclysmic World War. So there was a general feeling that totalitarian system cannot be overthrown by peaceful means. Fortunately, we didn't know that that was the opinion. And we always tried to find out some sort of a legal framework to give us some protection in independent activities. Helsinki Agreement was a bit helpful, but it was considered by Polish authorities and declared quite openly that this is sort of only a certain signal of certain intentions. It's not legally binding. And finally, we found out that there was one framework in which we could actually try to operate, and that this was International Labour Organization Charter. Poland signed this charter, and according to this charter, trade union could be set up without any consent and any approval of the government. Everything else required some approval of the court. Courts were not independent. So you could never get approval of the court, except trade unions. That's why we sort of decided to take this approach and form independent trade unions. And to cut the long story short, I would say that what happened in 1980, when finally an agreement was signed between Polish authorities and the strike committee led by Lech Walesa, was something incredibly important, because according to this committee, parties somehow accepted the fact that trade union which we were about to form would be sort of not under party control. It would be really independent trade union. And the trick which we used was that, the party will keep control in the state institutions, but not in trade unions. And that gave the rise to Solidarity, and very soon in Solidarity we had 10 million paying members. It was an explosion. And the fact that Solidarity could not really be controlled by the authorities using normal methods, and martial law had to be imposed, simply was a last nail in the coffin of the legitimacy of the system. That was extremely important, because it showed that this system simply cannot sort of operate democratically. And what was even more important, I would say, is not that the martial law was introduced, but the martial law, although it was, to be honest, from purely technical military point of view, was a brilliant operation. Politically, it was total failure. And it became absolutely clear that the system, at least in Poland, is so not suitable that tanks on streets simply do not solve the problem. And that's why, finally, when the whole situation started to change in 1981, in Poland's situation was entirely different.
Okay. So is this Polish pride speaking, Marcus or Michael, in terms of?
I really think that this is very important, what Janusz said. And I, all the time, was considering why a union. And you gave the answer. Yeah. Exactly, that's important, because I belonged to the opposition in that time. I was a Protestant pastor, and we had political groups, and I, from my biography, I was all the time in the distance to that system. But then, as a student, I studied philosophy and theology and the philosophy of law, and I all the time didn't understand why a union, because it's a mixture of social issues and political one. And you gave the answer now. So in 30 years later, that's great. Yeah, it's great to get this answer, that it was connected with that ego issue and the legal basis. That's great for me to have to be here to get that answer. But coming back to 25 years ago, the fall of the wall, I think it is important, and it was important for us when we were opposition in GDR. It was marvelous to see what happened in 1980 in Poland. It was really marvelous that it is possible that billions of people would belong to that. We thought we were only some groups spread in the country, that this is impossible with Germans. That was our feeling. You can't do it with Germans. And we were happy some years later, then we failed. Then there were 100,000, not members, but on the streets, and to get that power, to bring that together in the peaceful revolution, it was a marvelous event then too. But it was connected with that, what happened before in Poland, in Hungary. And that's why I always say we have to understand that the fall of the Berlin Wall is the symbol today of Central European revolution. What happened in Berlin, in East Germany, is a part of a Central European revolution. With what happened before and with Poland at first, in Hungary in quite different way, but it belonged together, and later then in Czechoslovakia. And for all of that, the fall of the Berlin Wall became the symbol.
Right.
It was sometimes not so good for Poland because Poland was first, and they sometimes said a little bit not so happy that especially the Berlin Wall became the symbol and not the round table. But if you see the photos of the 9th of November, that made that symbol. But for us in Germany especially, it is important, and Germany itself has not understood, in my view, understood, because we are usually celebrating in Germany the 9th of November together with the former allies, and especially the Americans would like to be a part of that, but you are not. Yeah. That's what you have to understand. Right. You are not a part of the 9th of November. Right. The Americans are a part of the negotiations. Right. You are a part of the 3rd of October. Right. This was really crucial to have, after the 9th of November, that process of negotiation in order to make, after the revolution, a structured process for bringing together, at first, to unite Germany, and then to have the next steps for unite Europe. But at first, there was a victory of freedom. Right. And the victory of freedom, to finalize with that, in difference to what is usually said in America too. Usually you look back and you are saying, in America, we won the Cold War. I would say, no. It was not the victory of the West, it was a victory of the values, because people in the East, with Solidarność, with opposition in GDR and in other countries, because there's all the time stick to that values. It was a victory of freedom and democracy in these countries, because the lessons learned from that is you can't develop, you can give a framework, you can give conditions for that, but freedom and development can only be established by people in the countries itself. That's a very good reminder. And that's a very important issue. It's a very good reminder. That's why I wanted to bring it to that point.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Marcus. So Janusz, do you want to come back?
Well, yes, I would like really to tell you, to explain to you why really, the 4th of June, the day when we won elections, was not seen as sort of a breaking point. The reason was that we downplayed the whole result very deliberately for two reasons. First reason was there was sort of the memento coming from the East, from Tiananmen, because at the very same day, democracy was crushed in China, and democracy was sort of nascent in Poland. So actually, we simply could not be jubilant and say, well, right, fine, communism is over, now we won. Well, we could not do it because of that, and also because there was some legal reasons why authorities could declare the elections null and void. Well, I do not want to go into details, constitutional details. That's why, I remember when I was called to comment on the outcome of the elections in Polish television, I really had a dilemma. Should I simply declare, all right, you are we are finished. Now it's our turn. Or should I say, well, nothing very important happened. You know, obviously we are moving. There is a process which begins, but you know, it is not something which marks the change of the political system.
So that's how you answered that.
Well, so I simply said, well, yes, it is very important. It's very good. You know, we got this result. Now we must move forward. But you know, I simply was not in a position to declare that communism is over.
But it's fascinating, Janusz, that the Solidarity leadership was very aware of how it was playing out historically in a way, vis-a-vis Tiananmen Square,
well,
vis-a-vis the stakes that were.
And you must remember that at that time we were absolutely alone, and also our partners from the West kept telling us, "Don't rock the boat," because Gorbachev could be threatened.
All right, well then, one of the voices, and we'll get to you, Consul General, in just a minute, but JD, since you were one of the voices from the West, what do you say about that?
That's very interesting to have this conversation, because indeed, as the United States looked at what was happening, let me just say for a moment, I was appointed Deputy Chief of Mission in East Berlin. The ambassador said, "You're young, you're not quite at the right rank, but we want to go there, and because it's going to be so boring, nothing will ever happen. These people are stuck, and they will not be able to do anything."
And when was that? What month was that?
That was
what year?
in October of 1988.
Wow.
I came in the spring, and we did a review from the United States point of view, along the line of what Janusz has said, that there is a movement, there's change in Eastern Europe, led by the Poles, and it's very cautious, it's very considered, and it's not going to move quickly. Then we turned to the Germans, and we watched in the May 7th election that there was a challenge to the communal elections, the municipal elections in East Berlin, and yet there were not a movement at that point, but rather what you did with the labor movement, we saw happening in the U.S. Embassy, where young Germans came in to look at the Helsinki Final Act in English to test whether they could demand from their government, without changing the government, just ask the government to follow what they had agreed in 1975 in the Helsinki Final Act. And one of those things was travel. The whole discussion in East Germany was about travel and how you do it in that summer until
people were going to Hungary.
Well, before that.
Okay.
And then Tiananmen Square took place. That reinforced our view that if anything happens, it will be happening very carefully. Gorbachev and Honecker were at odds with each other. Honecker was very much a Stalinist, very much looking for repression. Nobody thought in the spring and summer, particularly after Tiananmen Square, that Honecker would be thrown out. Mr. Krenz was sent to China.
Egon Krenz
was his crown prince. He was to be his successor. Then the Chinese foreign minister went to Moscow and then to East Berlin right after Tiananmen Square. So the point was, if you in East Germany, if people like Markus Meckel, if you are going to do anything, remember we have the China solution and we will use it. And there wasn't any movement to try to challenge that, and even by August, where the change was really evident, the New York Times did an editorial at that time saying if the Soviet Union will intervene anywhere, it will be in East Germany. That's where their interests are, that's where their military is, that's where the decision will be made. We believed at that time and in the summer that we were asked about the Berlin Wall. Would the Berlin Wall come down? We looked at that in the context of what I'm saying and said, not in our lifetime. And that was really the movement. And this is summer, and things begin to move very rapidly after August.
Michael, I wanted to ask what the view from your experience as a student, I guess, in Prague?
Yeah, no, I would like to say maybe a couple of points. First of all, the situation was a little bit different in each country, on many different levels. You know, like Czech people could travel, Germans couldn't. So, you know, the very smart people usually went and emigrated to the West. So that what happened in Czechoslovakia. So, you know, the economic situation also differed, history differed. So, you know, in Czechoslovakia, people always remember the period of democracy in Czechoslovakia between 1918 and 1938. So we had a very successful country for 20 years, and people could always relate to it. President Masaryk and all these historical figures were always very important reference for Czech people. And then we had the experience of 1960s and 1968 when there was one revolution happening called Prague Spring, and of course the Russian tanks came and crashed it in August of 1968. And that was basically the last point of anybody believing in the system. Because revolution of 1968 was more within the communist scheme of things, kind of to say. So there was not supposed to be free market economy. There was not supposed to be free elections. It was all within the party system. But it was people took the freedom and freedom of expression. But in 1989, when 1989 came, these ideas were already dead. People, since 1968, no one believed in the system. 90% of the population kind of suffered. No one believed in the values. They believed in the values of free market economy and democracy and freedom. And that's also why, actually, after 1989, the things started to move so quickly. People were ready. They were educated.
The psychological basis was already there.
They were not discussing, should we go one-party system, two-party system. No, we want to full-fledged democracy. And the first election in 1990, the free elections, we had 23 parties. So there was a lot of things basically getting ready, and that helped. And of course, I don't want to downplay any influence from the West or from Moscow, but it was really people's revolution.
Which goes back to the point that Marcus said.
Helsinki Agreement was important. It helped to set up Charter 77 of President Havel and these dissidents, but there were very few people, really. It was 1,000 people maybe who were actively involved. But it was people's revolution who really did it themselves. They were not helped by Gorbachev's policies. They had very little influence on the, there was no kind of glasnost in Czechoslovakia in 1980s. So it wasn't really help from the East or any kind of influence, but people were really fed up and saw what was happening in Poland, saw what was happening in East Germany or Hungary, and they said it was about time it happens here.
That's fascinating. And one thing I want to talk about is what happened. And if it sounds like we heard both from you, Michael, and Marcus, also you, that the events were really not created. It's not a question of whether it's Ostpolitik coming from the federal German government or containment or whatever policies pursued by the United States government. It was basically the people within the societies that created the change.
I wouldn't say that it is the same.
Okay.
I think that it was important to have that framework from the West.
Okay.
And especially that Helsinki Agreement, Final Act, was important. For instance, that journalists could live and report from the East. To have that information was really crucial.
Okay.
If you see for the opposition and for civil society, to have journalists, to have diplomats, to have that context to the West. And from that, to create and to get solidarity from outside. This was a crucial point. If people, for instance, in GDR were put in prison, you got the information from the West. During the 80s, when there was some action in Rostock in the north or in Dresden, then we got that information usually by the Western radio, by Deutschlandfunk. We got that information from there. And then by that we tried to get in contact to each other. I myself,
basically got the information from outside, but then that helped facilitate the information within each other. We got the information from outside, and then I drove with my car to Dresden, to Rostock, wherever, to get in contact, to look at people who were involved. And then we tried in the 80s to shape a network of that people, of that groups who came together. We had every year conferences of such groups in order to know each other, to get known each other, and to bring them in contact, to be able to have for common contacts. Okay. We had some Samizdat. Basically underground publishing.
Exactly, publishing to get known to publish papers, which was not possible in a usual publication way.
Right, you had
and this was really an important preparation for what happened in '89.
Very good. Jonas?
Well, I simply wanted to say about the Berlin Wall fall, because we knew from the very beginning that once Poland is basically going out of this communist camp. You know, the situation in East Germany is unsustainable. It will not be, it could not be sort of kept. And we knew that the Berlin Wall is about to fall. And when Chancellor Kohl came to Poland, it was in November 1989, we kept telling his entourage that, you know, well, what are you going to do about Berlin Wall? And said, well, all right, it will happen sometime. You know, we live up in Germany. You know, we were divided for centuries. Nothing will happen. No. It is really something very, very imminent. And the next day, Kohl had to break his visit to Poland and fly back to Germany to watch the Berlin Wall falling. That was the psychological situation at that time was very, very peculiar.
Well, as a U.S. taxpayer, I feel good that the German government was, or U.S. diplomats may not have been ready, but neither was the German government.
And I think that's actually true, because what you hear is that the revolutionaries didn't know themselves, although Poland knew right at the end that there was something dramatic about to happen. Even the revolutionaries themselves didn't know what kind of outcomes it would have, because they were confronting a government that could easily have used military force or police force. In fact, they did on October 7th, when the end of the 40th anniversary of the GDR party took place, and Gorbachev said in his famous misquote there, "Those who come too late will be punished. Mr. Honecker, please leave. We knew there was change. A lot was happening." In fact, on that evening, after Gorbachev got on the plane, the police did attack demonstrators throughout the country, arrested over 3,000 people, killed them overnight, drove them out of churches and vigils. This crackdown was indeed coming. And so, yes, there was clearly things that were happening, but you couldn't predict, at least from where we were sitting, what the outcome would be, except watch what was happening with the Soviet Union. Because if the Soviet Union kept its forces in the barracks, as Mr. Gorbachev promised, then you could see things developing in one way. If they got out of the barracks, then all bets were off.
So, JD, that's a good, we'll segue from beyond 1989, but that's a good segue. I do want to, before we leave that, you know, what was Vladimir Putin's experience of 1989, since he was, like you, a foreign official in East Germany?
He was a foreign official. He was a KGB person in Dresden. I was in Berlin, East Berlin, and we did not have any connection. But we did keep track of what was happening, and when the demonstrators in Dresden in the fall of 1989 went and attacked or ransacked the Stasi headquarters, which was across the street from Mr. Putin's house, he had actually brought in Soviet military to provide security for his house. And that was one of the triggers that we were very concerned about. He apparently, and he has later himself said, that what he did was he told the Germans in German, because he does speak fluent German, that if they attacked his Soviet Eigentum, Soviet property, that they would be shot. And the demonstrators disappeared and went on to other kinds of revolutionary acts. But the sense was, from my reading of Mr. Putin over the years, is that was street demonstrations that eventually brought down the East German government, brought down the other Eastern European governments, brought down the Soviet government, and Mr. Gorbachev, who had 380,000 troops in East Germany, did not use them. That is, he did not use force to maintain control or even to maintain stability, but rather faced the end of the Soviet Union for Mr. Putin, the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. And following that, Mr. Putin also saw what happened in Moscow when there was a putsch against a coup against Mr. Gorbachev, that too was brought down by people in the streets, that time led by Mr. Yeltsin, and again reinforcing the idea that if you let things happen in the streets, get out of control, they will bring down your government. And then in the course of time, I think we all have seen what has happened. The South Africans, the Arab Spring, the color revolutions, and now Kiev. This is a time when people go to the streets, bring down governments, and when you get to Kiev, Mr. Putin himself has said, the next is Moscow. So you get a sense that what we have in our narrative is quite different from what the sense, at least from my point of view, of what Mr. Putin's narrative is. In other words, he reacted to Mr. Gorbachev not using force, to use force, and to define His interest in terms right now of ethnic nationalism in Ukraine is along the lines of Mr. Milosevic. So it's a different outcome than what we had in 25 years ago.
And again, part of this is to bring the discussion to Ukraine, to the present day, but as we go very quickly into 25 years after 1989, one of the things that I think is worth talking about, we are an economic think tank, the Milken Institute. We always have to talk about the economics of it. If we could put up, Carlos, slide 9. And again, the events that happened after 89, very rapid economic reform and decisive economic reform in the Czech Republic and in Poland, in what became the Czech Republic. And you see the results there in the years between 1990 and 2012, the truly exponential growth of the Polish and Czech economies. And I think one of the reasons that is generally accepted is that, and of course, the German situation was different because it was national reunification. One of the things that was very marked was that both Polish and Czech governments pursued serious, real, fundamental economic reform very quickly. And I remember I had the good fortune to be in Warsaw in 1989 in June, and I met with an economist who was connected with Solidarity, and he used the expression, which I will never forget, that Solidarity, when it came into power, was going to do a leveraged buyout of the Communist Party. And I said, what do you mean by that? Because of course, you know, the leveraged buyouts at that time in the United States were financial events. He says, we will allow the apparatchiks, the people in control of the party, to have economic advantage from their positions of strength and power, but that will be in order to transition to a democratic and free market capitalism. So again, those policies and that kind of economic thinking, I think, informed partly the results that took place there. So, Michael, please.
I will just continue on what I said in the beginning. That slide clearly says what kind of position each country was in. You know, the Polish and the Czech governments had very experienced economists. So let's think about Balcerowicz in Poland, Václav Klaus, yes, the finance minister and next prime minister of the Czech Republic. They all had a clear idea how the country should move on and how should actually transform from 100% state-owned economy to free market economy, which is incredible transformation, and it was done within 2-3 years or 5 years in these countries, because they both understood that only private ownership really stimulates the economy. It's not a government, and it's a free market economy. Until these days, actually, when we have discussions in Europe, we kind of encounter our Western parts, which they don't understand our positions. Because sometimes we say, no, we don't want any social market, Wirtschaft, whatever. We want a free market economy, because that's the only way to get to this kind of chart. And then you face the Western Europeans, sometimes they don't understand, like, we have the social Europe, we have to protect it, we have this, you know, these values which are so crucial for 40 years, but they don't understand that things changed. You know, we are living in global economy, and the things which were kind of cheap and easily achievable in the past are not now need to be paid for. You cannot borrow money forever, etc. And this is the economic outcome of that you know, kind of paragraph.
Okay, great. Yes, Janos.
Well, I think that, you know, the fact that we could embark on this shock therapy was partly due to the fact that we were in absolutely despair situation, not like in Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia at that time. We had a hyperinflation going as high as about 800% a year. Everything was sort of falling, you know, apart.
And so this is just the period 1990. When are we?
That was the period 88 and the beginning of 1989. So that was the situation we inherited from the communist period. So that's why for this shock therapy, even communists voted for. You know, because it looked like there is no other way, really. We simply had to sort of, you know, be very, very radical. And it worked. And it worked to that extent that although it was painful, and we had many elections in the meantime, and in every election, the party that was at that time in the opposition claimed that we'll do things differently. There was a pure continuity all the time. And because of that, in Poland, we have, since 1990, a permanent growth. We never went into the red, even in the dark years of 2008, 2009.
In the last few years, you didn't have.
No, we did not have. The worst year we had was just 1% of growth. This year we will have probably 3.5%. So you know, this is absolutely different situation, and you know this. But the fact is that what really helped us was that we had to reschedule our debts,
right,
which we inherited from the communist period. And fortunately, we managed somehow, showing that we are absolutely determined to introduce all the reforms. We managed to convince our debtors to actually sort of more or less wipe away half of our debts. So that was helpful. And also the stabilization fund from the United States, which was given to us, which we never used, fortunately, because we managed so well that this stabilization fund need not to be used.
So
in fact, you gave back money to the United States. It's really unbelievable in the realm of money. I want to just make a comment about Eastern Germany, because that was quite a different process. Right. In July 1st, 1990, the first element of the German negotiations was a German economic and monetary union that resulted in the monetary union of Germany. So that is to say, suddenly East Germany's money was converted to West German marks. But what the impact was that if you had, it was about 1.8 to 1 was the exchange rate. It made individuals okay, but what it did for companies, for the economy, was it also did the same conversion for debt. And virtually overnight, all of East German industry that had any debt was unable to pay it. It actually collapsed. The whole economy was not able to sustain itself. So when you think about the solidarity fund that the Germans have imposed upon themselves, at 7+% surcharge on their income tax in order to make the transition to East Germany into the West, it's been taking 25 years. It's a very, very long process. But let me say for the Americans, it's a also an important part, the role that the economy plays in the relationship. What we did with the Poles was very good. We did some economic and financial things, and Belzrek spent a lot of time with the United States, and we were very close to that process. With Klaus the first time around was a different kind of relationship. But in East Germany, it was really led by the West German government that became the United German government. But what we did in 1990, an American businessman, Lou Hughes, came from Rüsselsheim, GM, and asked for the U.S. Embassy to help talk about making to build an automotive assembly plant in East Germany. He visited Eisenach, he visited an old Wartburg factory, brought in the CEO from Detroit. He said, this is a terrible place, it's falling down, it's a slum, there's 16,000 employees, there's no way this will ever work. Lou Hughes said he was going to pursue this idea in any case, and we got the Opel factory in Eisenach. Some of us in the U.S. government, that is Ambassador Holbrooke, later, and myself, decided that, one of the important things about the economy and politics in this change is to be present. So we started a 5-year program to reach out to each of the 5 states that joined the West German government in 1990 to do investment. At the end of that time, American companies had shown up all over Eastern Germany. So AMD and Dow and Guardian Glass and lots of other companies came in and invested in East Germany. So the transition, so that space between West Germany and Poland wouldn't become some kind of outlier without any business cultural, or any cultural connections. What Marcus mentioned about the values, what drove us together is the sense of values. And that transition needed to be, from our point of view, the U.S., be done with Americans. We were not going to station any troops, as we now are debating again about NATO.
We'll talk about that.
We put American business in Eastern Germany, and today in Thuringen, for instance, there are 65 American companies, one of the largest American presence. They carry with it not only business, jobs, and growth that we all talk about, but also a sense of who we are and our culture. So
That's
I only would like to mention that I think it is very important to see that linkage between foreign investment on the one hand and the rule of law in a country. You will only get readiness to invest in a country where you have really a developing rule of law in that field. And that's a problem in some other countries.
Slide 10, please. And this speaks to the point that Marcus made. You know, you'll see FDI increases in Germany and Russia, also Czech Republic. And one of the things as we transition to talk about Ukraine and even in Russia, the present day, the economic discussion is a really big and important part of that. So you made the point, Janos, and it's backed up also by what happened in the Czech Republic, maybe perhaps not as radical, but you know, economic transformation. Now, one of the questions that I wanted to pose is, as we look at the economic/political situation, whether it's in Ukraine, whether it's in Russia today, is part of what we're dealing with is a failed or a not fundamental economic reform, the reform that didn't take place, the economic dog that didn't bark in the 1990s, the coupon privatization in Russia in the 1990s that seemed to confuse people about free market capitalism and the transition enriched oligarchs. The Ukrainian situation, which has also not been a very strong economic reform. Is that one of the things we're dealing with now as we look at what's happening in Ukraine and in Russia? The mistakes that were not made in economic policy in the 1990s and in the early part of this century.
Well, I think that as far as Ukraine is concerned, there are two major issues concerning basically affecting the inefficiency of Ukrainian economy. One is corruption. Well, let's be sort of frank about it. You know, it is really something incredible, and Ukraine is very low on the list of Transparency International. Well, very much on the same more or less level as Russia. And the second thing is certain legacy of the communist period, and this is not independent judiciary system. Under communism, everybody who remembers, you know, the teaching of Marxism and Leninism knows that, you know, law was the instrument of the state. There was no possibility of courts to be being independent. And you know, now this is sort of still, you know, the situation in Ukraine. If you are a big businessman, then obviously you have a certain protection because your investment is somehow more or less, you know, accepted or endorsed by high authorities. So you have a certain protection. But if you are a small or medium businessman, you are at the mercy of courts in case you are in trouble. And then, you know, if you do not know how to pay, to whom to pay, and how much, then you are lost. And this is the trouble with Ukraine, and that is something which they should do immediately. And on top of that, I think, which is not so much related to economy, but which is very critical, is that they really should carry on with certain devolution process. That means delegating some powers to local authorities.
Political devolution, especially in the eastern part of the country?
Well, I don't mean turning Ukraine into a federation.
Right.
But, you know, to give some power of local authorities. Like we have in Poland, we are a unitary state. Well, the same with the Czech Republic. But nevertheless, you know, people right there, they know that they can run a certain amount of problems by themselves, and they have their own money, right. which is independent, which is important. So I think that Ukraine requires some, I would say, not only economic changes, but also political changes.
Well, so one of the things you raised the question, what is to be done with Ukraine? And one of the perspectives that you bring, Janusz, and also Marcus, you and Michael, you, from countries and from peoples who've gone through the transition in 25 years, what other things should be done, whether it's by Ukraine itself, the government, Ukrainians as people, or Western powers, or institutions, NATO, EU? So I'll just throw it out there, Marcus. What do you?
I really think that this, what Janusz mentioned, was really important. To have both of that. On the one hand, political reforms, on the other hand, economic reforms, and international help. And so I think that program of European Union to develop that Eastern Partnership program is really crucial. It is, in my view, too weak. We should have done more. In my view, we had to sign immediately after the finalizing the treaty, to sign it, in my view, 2011. Besides the question of Tymoshenko, you could raise that issue in the press conference after, but signing at first had been better than what we did. That's my deep conviction in that time too. And this was a mistake of European Union, in my view, but of my own government too. Poland tried to push it forward, and I can say we failed. That the European Union was ready. But this gave Mr. Putin the chance, in the end, with Yanukovych, to convince him to go another way. And so I think it was important for us to see, then in the end of the last year, that there were people fighting and going to Maidan, fighting for Europe and the European perspective. Inside of European Union, people are reluctant and even are not going to democratic elections for Europe. But there, people went to the street and really risking some things.
Did it make you remember events in 1989 in East Germany? And what was in Eastern Germany in terms of civic society, civil society?
That's much difference. But I think that it was really important that that population was fighting for their European identity. And that's, in my view, the first very important point. The second point is that we have to support them, and we have to accept that this government is a really weak one. And there will be next time, hopefully, a good observed elections, and then we have to go to their side and to support them in that reforms which Janusz mentioned. And on the other hand, we have not to accept that occupation. That occupation of Crimea. This we have to continue to refuse to accept it. And this has many consequences. And in my view, we shouldn't go with soldiers there, but we have to do it in a very concrete point, to stand by the people and to be very strong in that position, and not to say, okay, the Crimea is lost. It was often said,
well, you know,
Crimea is not lost.
You're making it, Marcus, very actual. You're making it very current. So I want Michael, you to come in on this.
I would like to just say that I completely agree what the speaker said. It's really the internal reforms, political economics are important. But this is a little bit like a long-term process, right? But we have an imminent crisis, and we have to first secure independence of Ukraine. That's not given at this point. And part of the country is occupied. And I'm coming from a country which was several times in the history, attacked. And in 1938, part of our territory was lost, because some big power was trying to protect the minority in Sudetenland. So it's basically the same playbook from a history. Then some collaborators in 1968 sent a letter to Moscow, please come to help us. It's like the Yanukovych letter. So it's just the Russians using the same historic tools, which we should be very vigilant about.
Well, let's talk about the policy mechanisms both the West and others have. So, JD, do you want to chime in on that or come in?
I would like to come back to what Marcus has said about the desire of the people of Ukraine to be part of the European Union and how that was managed. I don't think it was such a mistake that the EU reached out to do that, but rather that over time, when we did several things. First of all, we began with NATO enlargement after unification. So in 1996-97, when I was working with the United German government about NATO enlargement, we were making the argument, as Marcus has made, that this is what the people want, that the Poles and the Czechs and the Hungarians, and those first three, really wanted to be secure and to be safe so that they could build their economies and build their political system and democracy. We never then listen to what the narrative of the Russian side could have been, and I've been hearing a lot of that recently, Yes, but the Russians have been invaded by the Japanese, by the Napoleon, by the Germans, and they're very afraid of another invasion, and they saw the NATO enlargement as an effort by NATO to move into their territory to prepare for an invasion. I don't accept that narrative, but I think what's important is that the two narratives are not connected, and we did not have an opportunity to dissuade Putin from that wrong idea that NATO enlargement was to be, or EU enlargement was designed by the West as a grand strategy to overtake the Russian, what was left of the Soviet Empire. That debate we never really fully developed.
So having the lack of that debate now is a precondition for what's a little bit playing out today. Janusz?
Well, I think, first of all, I think that Putin simply is a product of his own sort of entourage of KGB. You know, for Secret Service, you know, they can operate if they have a clear image of an enemy. You know, and this is why that's quite I would say natural. And what is really so disturbing is that Putin now is simply overtaking a rather fragile but looked for us, you know, for quite some time, rather stable sort of stability in Europe. Because what he actually said, and what he says, is something really extremely dangerous. I think that he was encouraged by the outcome of the war with Georgia in 2008. Because everybody was concentrating on what happened in South Ossetia. South Ossetia crisis was really provoked by not very wise decision of President Saakashvili to shell Tsin Valley, to artillery shelling, which the Russians responded. They overdid it, obviously.
The provocation.
That was quite clear. But basically, at least as far as Ossetia was concerned, Russians had some sort of claim, or at least justification for what they've done. But there was another area which sort of completely was unnoticed. That was Abkhazia. Abkhazia is not connected geographically with Ossetia. And Russians simply invaded this area. The Black Fleet moved forward. They sunk the Georgian ships. They occupied the territory. This was a clear case of preventive war. Preventive war, because they said, well, nothing was happening in Abkhazia, we agree, but it could be that there would be something happening. So if Russians, you know, think that they have the right to intervene militarily, if they think without any other reasons, without any sort of acceptance of other countries, that, you know, that there is a problem, so they can intervene. And that's what happened in Crimea.
And is that also, how much is that playing out today in the events of the last few weeks, in terms of, do you think the Russian government believes that what's been said by the U.S. or by the German government or by others is truly serious?
Well, I think Putin, we do not know what Putin is going to do, but Putin knows quite well what we are not going to do. And this is the main problem. We know, he knows, and we know it as well, that we are not going to wage war against Russia, in case Russia sort of invades Ukraine.
Well, let me ask then.
But to help Ukraine, for example, in the case of hostilities, the same way as Americans helped Israelis in 73, well, is another matter.
That's a perfect segue, and we're going to go to take at least a couple questions before we wrap up. Because that is, you know, we use the expression sometimes ripped from the headlines. Well, this is a piece ripped from today's Wall Street Journal, an interview with Zbigniew Brzezinski, in which he's asked, you know, how to pressure Russia to accept the outcome of basically a condominium or some kind of arrangement with Crimea that does not recognize, you know, the events on the ground. And I wanted to put this out there and get everyone's reaction, or anyone who wants to chime in. Brzezinski says, I think it is important for the Ukrainians to recognize that they have to be willing to fight for what they want, and we have to be willing to make it clear that they will not be alone. That means offering Ukraine weaponry, defensive in nature, but suitable for urban warfare. And so I would ask the question, in Europe in 2014, is this a wise policy course to be thinking about?
Well, I think it is important to make some sort of gesture towards Ukrainians to sort of give them certain assurances and also to give a certain signal to Putin. Well, I think honestly that in case, as I said already, that in case of the outbreak of fighting between Ukrainians and Russians, which cannot be excluded. U.S., as I already mentioned, could actually offer Ukrainians the same kind of assistance as U.S. offered Israelis in '73. That was one thing. The second thing would be sort of applying to Ukraine a lend-lease policy.
Lend-lease?
Lend-lease policy from the Second World War.
I would argue there are two things dangerous in that process that Zabig has proposed. One is to use the military force without an analysis of what Putin will do. Because if we begin to do what you suggest in Georgia, give him an excuse to go in, then it becomes a trigger that he uses, and whether it's true or not, his propaganda is very good and he's very strategic. There are other things that we should be doing. Certainly we should continue sanctions, and we should increase the sanctions and be with the Europeans on sanctions. We should also, perhaps not in the first instance, but we should plan for forward defense, plan for missile defense inside NATO, and do more than the 600 troops that we were planning to send to the Baltics and to Poland. Those things begin to have an effect on the debate. You have to manage the debate. If you move too quickly in resupply, I was actually part of the resupply in 1973 as a 3rd Infantry Division lieutenant when the Israelis went into Syria and the Soviets prepared to send troops, and we prepared to send troops. I was one of those young lieutenants out there. We did send military equipment. And if you do this in a way that if it's a reaction to the Soviet Union, to the Russians in this case, and as it was to the Soviet Union, then it makes sense. It makes sense that if they start increasing their special forces activities, that you match that with kinds of lethal force as well as logistical issues and intelligence and the kinds of things that are necessary to combat that without actually having troops on the ground and perhaps not even lethal weapons, at least as there's a question of who goes first, and who manages that debate. There are lots of options that you have. The first options are economic and maintaining the solidarity with the Europeans. The Europeans are not prepared to go to war. We're not prepared to go to war.
Well, that's a good segue to one last slide I'm going to put up at 14. And while I do that, does anyone have a question that they want to pose to our panel? If not, actually, oh yes, right here, gentlemen. Yep, please use the microphone.
Thank you. I had a question actually about the comparison of economic growth and some of the choices around market forces versus the social Europe piece as it pertains to Hungary and Slovakia. If we think about the Visegrad Four, some of those debates played out somewhat differently in Hungary and Slovakia, and Slovakia, of course, is of the four the only that has the euro at this point. So I'm wondering, in terms of economic growth and decision making, how you see, any of the panelists, how you see those choices playing out.
Who would like to take that? Michael?
Maybe I start.
Yeah, I think you'd be qualified.
Maybe I start, since Slovakia was part of Czechoslovakia. Yes, the split of Czechoslovakia in 1992 was really economic split. It was very, I don't know if people understood, Slovaks, there was just about 1/3 of the nation really wanted independent state, but they were not willing mentally to go through shock therapy and to do these quick economic reforms. So they voted for leaders who promised them, soft paradise, so to speak, and they, package it in the nationalistic tones. And that, of course, helped these feelings to grow. There was a politician, he was a prime minister, his name is Vladimír Mečiar, and he was one of the leaders in Slovakia. But after years, Slovaks because of that, got behind. They didn't join NATO in the first wave, etc. And the people in Slovakia threw Menciar out in 1999 or 2000, around that time, and they voted for a center-right coalition headed by Mr. Dzurinda, and they implemented the same reform Václav Klaus implemented in Czechoslovakia in 1990s. And that's put actually very strong economic growth in Slovakia in the early 2000s. And eventually the country was actually ready to join Euro because they felt that it was an economic help that can Euro bring to Slovakia. But things turn out a little bit differently, and we don't have to go to the details what happens in Slovakia, and what happened in Greece and other countries. But really, that in Slovakia the situation was just postponed by 10 years. But they had very strong growth later because of the same free market reforms.
Very good. Just on the economic thing, I just threw up this slide. We're not going to have time to talk about it, but I found this fascinating. It basically shows the network of pipelines that are both existing now between Russia and Western Europe and the ones that are being planned. And one of the things that, as you can see, it's more, not to get the data, but more the directional, some of the things that are on the drawing board actually in the building process. There's, one of the discussion points about the economic relationship with the Russians is basically the leverage that Putin and others have vis-a-vis natural gas supplies through Ukraine to Ukraine and to the rest of Western Europe. And one of the things, really, the point to take from the slide is there are new pipelines being constructed, some of them already there, that allow much more. It's not a one-way street. There's going to be a lot more opportunity for people to get around, find other supply, even liquefied natural gas that might come from the United States and other places. So I do want to take the moderator's prerogative and ask a final question of each of you. And I have not prepared our panel for this, but here we are discussing events of what happened 25 years ago, and a little bit the relevance of today. So I'd like to ask you to say what you hope. If we'd had this discussion in April of 1989, if the Milken Institute Global Conference had existed at that point, we might have, not you folks, but other people might have missed the significance of what was going on in Europe. Hopefully, we've got insight from the experiences that you all have had. What would you hope for in 25 years, Michael? What would you hope either on a macro level in Europe, for the Czech Republic, in terms of, and one thing I think it's important, when we look at what happened in 1989 and the effects, it's an incredible positive story. It's an amazingly powerful example of the power of human beings, individuals, to work together and to affect change. And we shouldn't lose sight of that as we focus on some of the very tough things that are happening in the present day. So, Michael?
No, I think, I hope that we continue in the peaceful life in Europe, and I hope that the economic development in Europe and the United States will go hand in hand. We are in very good discussions regarding transatlantic partnerships, and we have a treaty being discussed called TTIP. Yep. It's investment and economic cooperation between European Union and the United States, because these two entities are the closest as partners in the world, and if we are able to work together, we are able to set global standards and help the better of the world. And speaking of that picture, I think the role of the United States here a little bit is to help Europe with LNG independence and the natural gas independence, because you really see the lines are going all east, and there are very few going north-south. Exactly. And that the only project which European Union was working on, which didn't include Russian gas, is put to ice. It was called Nabucco. It was supposed to bring gas from Azerbaijan to Europe. And there was not enough political will and finances to bring non-Russian gas to Europe. So,
very good point. Thank you.
Here is a chance for partnership.
Thank you, Michael. Janusz, 25 years from now?
Well, I would say that what we really need is to have Europe more, I would say, more integrated and with better decision-making sort of capabilities. Because, well, when I spoke once with somebody from Africa, he said that if Chinese said that they are on something, you know, that they begin to construct next day. If Europe says that Europe is going to do something, that they set up a committee which will present a report in 2 years' time. So, you know, what we need is absolutely a more robust, more integrated, and with certain efficient decision-making mechanism, because, you know, I really can understand President Obama that he didn't want to go to European Union to talk to, because, well, he probably thought not quite rightly that, you know, Europe simply cannot deliver. Europe must deliver, and then Europe will be really an indispensable partner for the US to solve the problems of the 21st century.
Very good. Thank you. Marcus?
I immediately can continue, because exactly that is our challenge. Sometimes the Americans were afraid that Europe could be not only follow, but really be an independent partner. But I think that has changed, and yes, Europe has to do it. And that's why I think, looking forward 25 years, I would say, then we will have another Turkey, which is member of European Union, in which you can speak fluent Kurdish, in which churches can live and educate the people, in which there is a heritage of the Armenians, which is publicly acknowledged. That will happen in 20 years, in my view. Then, in 20 years, I think we will immediately before finalizing the treaty about membership of Ukraine.
I was going to ask.
Then we will have good ties with Russia, which is changed in a democratic way. And this is trying and is going forward really to modernize and not to be dependent only of that its resources in energy, and really to become modern democratic country.
Thank you. One of the quotes in the last few days has been Senator McCain saying over and over in various media appearances, Russia's a gasoline station masquerading as an economy. So, JD, last word.
I'd like to see us defeat the rising nationalism that has come with this most recent activity of Putin and the Russians, and reestablishing the transatlantic relationship that is defining and defending the roles that we have, not only in Europe, but also in Asia. China and Japan have nationalism that is very hot, very tense, and very difficult. And the less we are able to do with the Russians and their nationalism, the more the Chinese and others will use their nationalism to create more tension and more conflict in the world. I think that's probably the most important thing, that, as Marcus has said earlier, if we could return to the rule of law, or as Michael said about the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership or the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that you can establish rules that make sense, that defeat nationalism, I think we will then have the right path for the next 20 years.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody, for the hopeful note, the insight, and please give a round of applause to our distinguished panelists. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks for joining us.